Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Administrative Services Committee meeting for May 12th. This is not our normal date. We've advanced this in order to discuss one item on the agenda, which is ordinance number 084-2025. Before we get to that, I should take, attendance. Vice Chair Petrus is here. Cobb, the chairman, is here. Also joining us are council members Davita Russell, Anthony Maddox, Gail Larson, Jim Posh, and the other member of this committee, the council president, Tony Kuda, is excused. He had another conflict for this evening. So getting back to the agenda item, this is an ordinance that was introduced by Vice President Russell. I don't know if she has any comments that she wants to make on it. If not, I'll just open the floor for questions and discussions. You really don't need to wait to be recognized by me.
I just want to add, after going over it, I did like the amendment that the mayor wanted to add as far as the mayor or designee. I am very comfortable with that.
Okay. Anything else that anyone else wants to add? You had some questions. Go ahead.
And that was one of them, so thank you for that. I wanted clarity on that. Just a couple of things. Just upon review, several residents asked, and I was curious too, are we sure that with the wording here for city that includes not just contracts that were initiated by the administration, but council contracts as well with this wording?
I'm quite sure it would be. I think transparency should be across the board. So yes,
Okay.
my answer to that question would be yes.
Okay, and I figured so. So I didn't know if there's any way we could spell it out just to make that clear that our contracts are included in that. I think that would be helpful. Along with that,
Where are you? Just because
I'm sorry. I'm 1.A. 171.16 under city contract publication requirement, A1. Just to make sure it's described that way to make it clear that we're responsible for that as well. And then along with that, I had two questions, one for council and anything that we do, and then another one in general. I wanted to take a look just from a compliance standpoint at any retention schedules or timeframes. When we developed this, were we aware of what those retention schedules currently were for any of the departments? And the reason I'm asking is I didn't know if they were consistent across the board and what that looks like based on the fact that these will be posted based on the retention schedule. But I didn't know if anyone knew what that schedule was across the board for the departments across contracts.
I let the law department do that piece.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
So you bring up a good point. I mean, the city doesn't have a public information officer that would keep track of that. And although I don't think that's the subject of this legislation, but I mean, I think we really need to have a formal public information officer role with duties. I don't know who that would be. I believe the mayor just out of default serves that purpose right now. Maybe it could be a member of the staff, maybe it could be a member of the law department. But I mean, I think that's something that we should take up at least some point in time. So it's good to recognize that. Well, not necessarily a position, but more as a role.
Okay.
We had one at the school district, and it was very, very, all public information requests went through, and they were cataloged. For example, how long information was to be made available on the website. Just all the information that you would manage and get out to the public.
That's why I was curious, because part of my role in several organizations was that retention policy, and it was laid out in terms of what processes or departments had what policy. And so I just want to make sure if we're spelling this out, that it's easy for even the public to know what that policy is. And so anything that we create around it that can help that, I think would be helpful just looking at this legislation, because one of the questions I had, when this comes up is we're going to keep it up based on those policies, but I think it would be helpful for people to know what those retention dates actually and timeframes actually are, because they may not be good enough for what we want. That's why I was asking. In some cases, they may be shorter or longer, and so I just want to make sure that we know what they are. Because if we're tying this legislation to that, I just want to make sure that that timeframe is actually acceptable for everybody. But I didn't know.
But I left that to the law department
Okay.
to do.
Sure, let me just note that the mayor has joined our meeting. Go ahead.
So, Councilmember Maddox, are you suggesting that we alter this legislation to include, having, at least 1 year back worth of information? I'm pulling something out of thin air without really thinking about it, but
That's what I was thinking. Essentially, at least have something that's at least set for this versus it every policy or every contract shifting based on what department. Because who's ever working this, it might be easier if they just know, okay, this will stay up until this date versus I got to check to see where this came out of to kind of update it. Is why that's exactly what I was thinking. Because and again, and maybe the current retention policy is acceptable, and maybe it lines up across the board, but without knowing it, I was just curious, and that's why I think it would be easier if we just set that posting date and that posting policy versus going with the retention if it's off. But I don't know without that date, so that's why I was putting it out there.
I'm thinking that section 4, maybe we can define it better, because section 4 speaks to a time frame, which is a little bit nebulous to me. It says the ordinance shall take effect and be enforced at the earliest time permitted by law. So, Vice President Russell, do you have any idea what that was meant to indicate in terms of, do we go back in time to pick up contracts? Do we start the day that the legislation is approved by the mayor?
I know it was discussion about going back to, I think President Kuda talked about actually going back in time and bringing those contracts forward. When the law director put this together, I think that's what he put that there to do that, to be able to go back if you wanted, but it didn't give a time frame on how far back.
Okay,
So I guess that could be clarified.
yeah, I would like it to be, because there's a capacity issue here too.
Mm-hmm.
It's how much burden can we put on whoever it is that needs to go back into the contract files and pull that information out and make sure it's posted according to the legislation, so.
Well, I'll talk to the law director about clarifying that piece.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think we really need to have a start date, because otherwise there's gonna be we're not gonna see something for a long time, just knowing how stuff happens around here. So I would suggest
I
that
wrote that in.
we put a start date.
Yeah.
And then possibly a start date when we want this to go into effect for everything moving forward, and then also a start date on if you want anything retroactively. I mean, in a perfect world.
Moving forward and start date retroactive.
Right, in the perfect world, you'd probably wanna do this on a calendar basis, so do you wanna, so you'd be able to so citizens would be able to compare year after year and have at least a year's worth of data historically available. But you can't expect staff to pull something like this together overnight.
Right.
But you do wanna see stuff that is immediately being signed on and acted on to get posted. Has anybody looked at, Lakewood has a provision? Has anybody looked at this in Lakewood, or did they just do that just because they thought it was a best practice and they didn't feel like they needed legislation for it?
I don't know. I just know it's posted.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether they've got legislation on that or not. I'm assuming the start date would be the ordinance date that will take effect once it's signed. Mayor, I know at our last meeting, you had raised a question about the mayor or designee, and so that did come up before you arrived. I don't know if you had any other thoughts or comments about this.
Well, I wasn't involved in the conversation that preceded this legislation's introduction. So maybe there's some background information that it would be useful for me to understand better, just in the sense of, having that background allows me to be a little bit more sensitive to the needs that are underlying the introduction of the legislation. And so I'm wondering if maybe somebody could sort of synopsize sort of what prompted it, what's the sort of if there's a set of current events that, sort of brought this to the fore, I'd like to know so that I can focus on a specific example maybe and move forward with the understanding of, avoiding something if something was something, sort of negative prompted it, or if something positive prompted it, and I can use that as an example as well. I don't know how much you guys got into that sort of underlying philosophical or historical impetus behind the introduction, but Vice President could fill me in.
Yeah, we didn't get into the history of it. We sort of discussed that and the reasons for it at the committee of the whole.
Could maybe just a bit of an expansion on that to help sort of guide my thoughts on this?
I think my recollection of the discussion was that we had concerns over the Burgess contract.
That particular contract?
That was one reason. The $48,000 amount just, I think, was troubling to some of us on council. And also the other reason, I think it's good for transparency that our contracts do get posted. I think you acknowledged that at our last meeting as Lakewood posts them so the residents can see the contracts and the amounts and what they're for.
Okay, so
in one easily
specific
accessible
acute-
place.
One acute, specific thing that sort of is an example of a general transparency philosophy.
Right, I think this would have been a good thing to have, even going back to before we changed the form of government, I think it would have been a good practice had our finance department, as a matter of course, posted all of our contracts.
Okay. And I don't want, you're the chair, but the introducing sponsor is here as well. Does all of that sound accurate in terms of your mindset in introducing the legislation?
Mindset is just total transparency after going through the budget hearings and all of that things we found. I guess I would say that it was best to have things very transparent so that the residents and everybody could see what was going on. Basically just transparency, and I've looked at some other cities where they actually have their budgets, their receipts, and a lot of documentation just on record and on their website. So to kind of blend in with a lot of other cities, just some transparency.
Okay, so not any specific contract in particular.
I'm not gonna say not one specific thing.
Would you be willing to expand? The chair mentioned one contract. I just want to make sure.
I heard him mention his
If there
thing.
are others, I'd like to know what they are so that I
Mine
can.
is total transparency, just trying to get total transparency.
The problem with others is that we may not know about them.
You may or may not. I really don't know what it is that any individual council member knows about. But if there were certain specific things that people had concerns about, then sort of the prophylactic of this legislation potentially for the future is useful. But then additionally, if there are particular contracts that people do have concerns about, I'd like to be given the opportunity to address those concerns in some way. If not, if people are not willing to provide that transparency, I guess, that's fine, and I will just take it as it comes. But otherwise, if people are willing, I've heard about the Burgess contract, people have specific concerns about that. And maybe somebody can, at some point, possibly in a different setting, let me know if there are any other concerns that I can specifically and directly address as we work through this policy change.
I'll just speak for myself. That Burgess contract's the only one that I'm aware of. I don't know what other contracts are out there that are less than $50,000 that I'm not aware of. And I'm certain that there are lots of contracts that the city has entered into.
I imagine so. Over the years, certainly.
Did you have a?
Yeah, I did. So way back when we were trying to finalize the budget, I shared at the finance committee about lowering the approval threshold from $50,000 to a lower number. And I made that suggestion because of a lack of trust I felt with the administration on council getting information and understanding what was out there, what wasn't out there, what we should know about, what we shouldn't know about. And at some point in time later, we were sitting at this table and Law Director Hanna mentioned something along the lines of this idea, because I do believe it came from him, Bill Hanna, about, why don't we just post these? And I think maybe there was another conversation, but it seemed to me that that was, from my perspective, a much better step to get the transparency that I was looking for by lowering that $50,000 to a lower number. This seemed like it was a much better
Compromise.
well, I'm not sure I'd use the word compromise, but I understand.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just more of, from an operational perspective, I think it's easier to digest.
Mm-hmm.
I think for the time being, I think it suits the purpose.
I'll tell you, just for background and transparency, I guess, from my part, in all likelihood, the conversation that you had with the law director may have, at least in part, been born of a conversation that I had with the law director as well, where I discussed with him the possibility of lowering the threshold for council's approval and for the competitive bidding that the state has recently made some changes to. And through that conversation, one of the ideas that I had that I presented to the law director was a notification arrangement, where a requirement where we would be required to publicly notice. I mean, it was, in my view, it was all contracts, but I don't know what became sort of the threshold discussion thus far. And so my idea was sort of a compromise, I guess, not really though, just that the threshold change for approval should probably be going the other way as opposed to reducing, just from a governmental efficiency standpoint, and the fact that when this threshold was created, the costs for things were dramatically different, especially now, which presumably is why the state changed its threshold. My idea was that we mirror the state and just stay with the state, and as the state changes, we change with it, but then apply this notification requirement so that the administration is constantly keeping both the public and the council up to date on all of our contracting. As sort of an addition to that raising of the threshold for actual operational efficiency purposes. But maybe that'll come a little bit later. I think if that Burgess contract is the only one that anybody is sort of directly pointing to, that's fine. And we can probably have more conversation about that contract and the work when we get there. So I think there's frankly a lot of misunderstanding about the work that they've been doing. But, and so it'll be nice to sort of put that to bed. But when it comes to this, you've addressed that one issue about whether or not the mayor would be required directly and specifically to notify city council of anything, as opposed to being able to designate somebody to.
We're gonna add designate to that, the mayor or designee.
All right. And I don't know if we're looking at adding this, okay, this is 171. I'm gonna open up the actual code real quick just to see where it is in context. Okay. All right, so you guys put this in 171, starting in 171.16?
That's what I got.
Okay. Okay. Can I ask about did anybody explain the 7,500 lower sort of limit of the reporting?
I had it down to zero to 50,000, and it was recommended from Councilman Cobb that we start with 75 because that may be too taxing on staff to start with 0 and move up to 50. So I was okay with that.
Was that based on anything or just a thought?
I think Lakewood's amount is 7,500. I'm on their website right now. I think that might have been where that number came from. Let's see.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, please, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Just weigh in.
If I could just make a general comment and then make a suggestion on the legislation before my iPad's battery dies. So initially I was supporting the idea of reducing the threshold, but when thinking about it, I think that this approach helps to achieve what I would want by reducing the threshold, which is increased transparency, and this will not create substantially more time for the law department. If we required them to come before us for approval for things under 50,000, if we were to reduce that, that could create a lot of additional work creating new legislation. So I really like this approach better. But if I could make one very small suggestion, thinking about, this talks about there being a table that
Where are you at?
this is subsection B. So 171.16 subsection B. Says that there should be a table with no less information than the following. And one of the items, number 4, is contract terms. So in thinking about a table on a website and just thinking in terms of people being able to easily navigate through it, just like to suggest that maybe we consider, instead of the contract term, like the execution date, so that people could more easily see them in chronological order
Oh, I see.
of the order in which they were executed.
I like that.
But that's minor, and so just making that suggestion.
I like that.
Take it.
That makes sense.
Along with that, B also limits how you can go about that. In a sense, it says or similar search-enabled format. I just want to make sure we wouldn't be limited to a table, just because of the amount of information that they'd be able to pull. Along with that, my concern was Addie. I feel like if we've got it already there, let's just commit to pulling up the link versus having her send this out and add it in. That was one of my biggest concerns about this legislation, is that added step. If the public can do it, and it's open to us, I don't know if there's something we can do to alert ourselves to trigger. I just hate to put something else on her to pull up to say and go through to say these are the ones that have been added. That just seems like a lot to me, especially with that threshold.
Well, basically what it was, when we talked about it with the law director, and actually she was in the room. It was basically like when she gave our packets, just giving us a sheet or list of these are the contracts or consulting agreements.
Do you know how easy it is for her to compile it? That's what I guess I would want to know, is how she has to pull, like how quick would it be? Or is this something that she's got to go in? Because if the system doesn't require her, let's say if she can go in and edit it and say, give me new contracts from these dates, that's one thing. But if it doesn't allow her to sort and she's got to scroll through maybe by department, so that's my concern, is the how. And it's actually not just about Addie, it's about everybody, just in terms of the admin piece of this, who might be responsible for it. This goes back a little bit to Councilman Posh's point, is just making sure that we're adding work to somebody or a couple of people. And I'd just like to know who this was impacting and how, who's gonna be doing that reporting or how this works, just because there is some admin work behind this. And I don't know if it's an existing person, if it's a new person or what. I'm just always asking when I see something like this and reporting and any changes, is who's being impacted from an administrative standpoint.
Yes.
You know, one of the things we don't know, but with the city of this size, there's gotta be someone that's managing these contracts because they have expiration dates. They sometimes have things that require us to do. They just don't sit in a box someplace. I mean, maybe it's fragmented is not the right word because that has a negative connotation. Maybe it's at the department level, so each department, manages their own contracts. Maybe it's in law, but I mean, it seems to me that someone is already doing some administrative work with this. Yeah, it's an extra step. But you already have a law department that's actually blessing a contract anyway. So there's procedures and protocols I'm going through this. I just don't see where this is an onerous ask of the administration. So.
For what it's worth, I agree. I don't think it's an onerous ask of the administration. I will say, when you get into questions about a look back and that type of work and reconstructing and putting things together, you're probably going to see some trade-offs. And I don't know, in terms of staff time, effort, energy, you add more tasks, that means that, other things will have to be traded off because there are only so many hours in a workday. Now, we might be able to get around that in some creative way, but then that's just a different trade-off. That's additional money to contract with somebody to go through things and, try to put that together and do that look back. But I think, like I said, on a philosophical level, all of our contracts are public record, as well they should be. So this just makes it a little bit easier for people to take a look at it. I don't have a problem with that. I was a big fan of Open Checkbook. I was hoping that we would do that at the county when I was working there. It was implemented with limited utility, but it was there, at least for some period of time. This may be a better way to do it, or we might find a way to work with the state to do it a little bit differently. Although the time frame might make that a little bit different. If you're talking about a 15-day limitation, maybe working with the state wouldn't be possible because their timeframes are a little bit different. But like I said, I think that the question about being able to search by execution date isn't a bad idea. I'm glad that you guys had this meeting to have those sorts of your questions answered and ideas offered.
Yes.
Okay, so I've got two thoughts. If there's some consideration of going to Open Checkbook, I would hope that it would come to the finance committee so we can discuss it there.
Hold on just a second. Hello?
Should I continue or not continue?
He did ask us to hold on a second, so let's give him a minute or two. And Jim, you've got to leave soon, right? And you have something as well.
Jill has a question too.
You want her to ask her a question?
Not about Open Checkbook, but if there's a second item, I'm gonna talk about
Go
that.
ahead.
So the second item was, I'm concerned about Civic Plus being able to come up with a prepackaged page that we can use in order to implement this without any kind of consulting. So can we just use the existing, just list everything in order? And so you could search anyways through the site because it'll give you a global search. But if we actually have to then add some search functionality in the website to sort something by a date, I don't want to see us delay this because we're doing that.
Yeah, I'm sitting here looking at Lake Woods and they just started at a date and it's just in chronological and there are hundreds here. It's fairly easy to go through.
I don't think we need to overcome. I honestly think that like a simple HTML table could be sufficient. Like if there is a search functionality, that's great. If we could sort, by header, great. But I don't think that it needs to be complicated. Civic Plus, to be honest, through my experience using it, it can be clunky and frustrating, and I hope that we don't use that. I would much prefer just a simple table, like in the finance department section of the website or
I'm so glad
something.
you said that, but being an IT person, it is.
Okay,
Mr. Cobb, how
yes,
many,
please.
how many, on the Lakewood site, how many listed components do they have on their table? Like, we've got 6 we're looking at as searchable
They have
per contract.
a description of what it is, like fire alarm upgrade project,
Okay,
who the company is they've contracted with, and the date.
okay,
And they're just in chronological order. Road salt, Cargill Road Safety, So they've kept it simple, and for our purposes, I think that's good enough.
mhm,
The one question I don't recall is the burden on Addie to start adding this to our packet. Is that really necessary when it's available or will be available on our website?
That's what I was getting at. It's like I prefer if it's there's a resource that we target that versus leaning on her for something else. It's just my issue with that. I think if it's publicly available, it'd be.
And I think the sense behind that was that every council person need to have a nudge that these are contracts that's coming up, because life takes on, and things that you may miss just because you didn't go look on the website. But if something that you're nudged about saying there's 5 different new contracts up, then to kind of look at it or something. So that's the purpose of that, for the simple fact, life takes over sometime and you're not focused, and sometimes you need to have somebody nudge you to focus or say, hey, check your email or something.
I don't know how many contracts there are that it would end up on the list.
That's my
I mean,
concern.
there are likely dozens at any given
Small
month for all of the purchase amounts. So we could always ask Addie to start doing that rather than bake it into the legislation. That would be my recommendation.
That part's
For
easier.
job description.
Right.
Can we just ask Addie during our regular, there's a time in the meeting where Addie has a report. Can we just ask her in her report to just name the largest contract that's been posted? In this way, it'll clue us in to something and make it more unofficial. This way, it's simple, it's already out there. She's just reminding us, hey, look, we had a $10,000 contract for, I don't know, taking the salt off the stairway when we come in and out.
there's your nudge.
Yes.
I got a couple of things, but this one thing I wanted to talk about tonight, I think the rest of them I can send them out or talk to you, but section E, under 171.16 under that same section. So section E, the mayor shall notify city council of any instance of noncompliance with this section. Such notice shall outline the reasons for noncompliance and propose corrective actions. Just some clarity around that.
The law
dates,
director
times.
put that in there.
Okay.
That came directly.
Because I'm just wondering, like, what's considered non-compliance, what's a corrective action, the dates, what's any instances of what's the time frame to report these? Is it him directly again or the designee?
I think in anywhere it says the mayor, we agree to do designate.
Okay,
But that language came from the law department.
okay. Yeah, I've just got a ton of questions about it.
Let me make sure that, Mayor, was there something else that you wanted to follow up with us on?
Just sort of maybe.
Open checkbook.
Yeah, the open checkbook has a particular set of timelines that I think this council would not be happy with. So I think it's probably best to just abandon that for now. Maybe we can pick it back up with the state at some point in the future. But open checkbook, you'd be looking back at things from quite a while ago if you rely on open checkbook, and I don't think that that's what you're after. I will say that, the context of this legislation being brought and specifically related to the Burgess contract, and I think Councilman Pasha's comments in this meeting is that I've been accused of being untrustworthy by members of this council in a variety of ways and by certain people in the public around the Burgess contract in particular. And there's been some sort of call for some sort of, inquest into that contract. And we've had meetings about it where I was sort of grilled a little bit. And I get you guys need to do your due diligence and you want to be comfortable with what the administration is doing and why and all of these things. Now obviously sometimes it can spin out into a rumor mill situation where people are being fed conspiracy theories about me using city resources for like campaign purposes or something ridiculous like that. But in this case, it's sort of an interesting political environment in which we find this legislation. I'm wondering about sort of what the thought is about presenting this in a particular frame so as not to run into sort of the optics concern that the chair has mentioned about other legislation from a year ago. And so I'm wondering sort of in terms of, working through this, what the calculation is among the committee members, but among the council members generally, around the optics question. Do you not see the same connection here?
Well, I'm not going to get into that this evening. We have two council members that need to leave again, and I don't want to steer this into a political discussion or more political than I think it needs to be.
Okay.
So just to summarize, we're going to not, as I understand it, we're just going to have this legislation apply going forward, right? As opposed to having to look back and trying to collect all that data. Because there's no retroactive provision in this legislation now.
That was Council President Tony Kuda's. That was part of his conversation, so I don't know.
But I don't see it in here. It just takes effect when it takes effect.
Correct.
And again, as
But
the
they
mayor.
did say, to clarify, to put, starting dates moving forward or starting dates to look back.
Well, the ordinance shall take effect and be enforced at the earliest time permitted by law.
Mhm.
So that's when it would start applying. Are we okay with removing this provision with Addie and just making that part of her job description or one of her duties?
I'm fine with that.
And then we're going to add the mayor or designee in A1.
I'm fine with that.
Anything else?
So any language we could do to clean this up is to make sure that it's the council and the mayor
I'm sorry.
that's built out.
Oh, wait, it wasn't A1, it was E, section E was the concern. A1 allows the mayor shall cause each fully executed contract, so that allows for me to put a system in place or task an individual to post those things. But E, section E is the issue, where, it might be more efficient and effective to have someone else notify the council, because you might be able to do it, you might be able to get that notification a lot faster if I'm occupied with other things.
Mayor, I thought we
So-
were gonna put it in both places, mayor or designate.
Either way,
I
I mean,
thought that's what
you could add it to A1 if you wanted to, but I think the language
And to
in
E as
A1
well?
Well, I was just
Okay.
saying the language in A1, I believe, accounts for that efficiency concern, operational concern already. The only need that I saw for that specific issue was in section E.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was fine with adding that.
Anything else? Yes.
And then in
Please.
B4, changing that from the contract term to execution date.
Or alternatively, it could be an additional item instead of a removal of the contract term.
That Lakewood has terms on theirs and it's very messy to sort through. So my suggestion is execution date, but again, it's minor. So if people would prefer
No, I
As
mean
it
a
is.
both and sort of situation, so you can add an additional item to this list, so you'd have 7 items instead of 6.
But still, if you were to search or if you were to try to sort on contract term, then you run into the issue like what you have on Lakewood's website where you can't easily navigate it. So that's what I was suggesting, but
I'm sorry,
if folks,
can you run by that again?
changing B4 from contract term to execution date.
Because the emphasis is on searchability, is that what you're saying?
So that you
Yes.
can more easily go through it, whereas, in Lakewoods, for example, it's sort of like a free response field and you can't easily sort across them. So you have contracts May 2021 next to December 1st, 2020, next to 2022. It's just not as nice as if you had a single date in there that you could easily sort on.
Okay, anything else? All right,
On this particular,
yeah. What time did you have to go? Now?
Sooner the better, to be honest, so that I could get back in time.
So the only reason I scheduled this meeting
Just for
was to have this. That's it. I'm not, and I don't know why Addie put other on the agenda, but I'm not gonna discuss any other tonight.
Okay.
So with that, the meeting is adjourned.